Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here in one of our last panels for this event. We are in this deterrence and conflict management in space, and we will have with us our first speaker, Kimbra L. Fischel. She's a political scientist specializing in U.S. national security, conflict and warfare, and strategic intelligence. She received the Doctor of Strategic Intelligence from American Military University on June 2022. She also holds an MA in Political Science from the University of Oklahoma. She has taught courses in international politics, American government, and the American presidency at the University of Maryland at College Park, George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and the University of Oklahoma in Norman. She currently teaches courses in international relations, peace operations, and revolutions for American Military University. She also teaches for the University of Oklahoma, where she designed the online course, Homeland Security and Emerging Threats. She has published numerous articles and book chapters and presented papers at major conferences, the most recent being the ISA 2022 in Nashville, Tennessee. After her, we will have James J. Rooney, Jr. He's Boeing Senior Manager of the Guidance, Navigation, and Control System aboard the International Space Station. James has spent the last 22 years working on Air Force Tactical Space System and the NASA ISS. Before that, he served 28 years in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He's a command pilot with over 3,500 hours of flight time. He has a master's degree in systems engineering management from Houston Baptist University, a master's in space operations from the Air Force Institute of Technology, and a master's in intelligence studies from American Military University. He's currently a doctoral candidate with American Military University in strategic intelligence. His main interests lie in space architectures and the weaponization of space, and he has a very strong interest in the planning and new system development strategies associated with the U.S. Space Force. So I will now give the floor to Professor Kimbra Fischel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. I am going to try and share my screen, and I'm not sure what that is.
There you go.
Does that work?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, I'm trying to turn this into a slideshow. Are we there? Looks like we're there.
You're there.
So thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges of deterrence in space in an international environment that is experiencing the return of great power conflict. And this research is for an article that is underway entitled Deterrence Theory and De-escalation of Inadvertent Space Conflict. And I ended up putting a question mark on the end of this title because as I got into the research, I began to wonder how likely it really is that inadvertent space conflict can be avoided due to the nature of the changing international system. And this gives rise to the research question, which is, what are the challenges to deterrence in the space domain, given the rise of near-peer adversaries in the existing international structure? The February 24th, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine highlighted the prospect of great power conflict extending into the space domain because it posed a significant risk of conflict spilling over to the NATO alliance. Nearly 2 years prior to this invasion, Frank Rose, a former Obama administration official in the Department of State, observed that NATO's space assets would likely be a first target in a confrontation between Russia and the alliance. Russia identified NATO and US dependence on space-based information and command and control for both nuclear and non-nuclear weapons as a vulnerability, and emphasized that an attack on enemy space systems can be used as a deterrent. As China observed, international reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it publicly restated its claim on Taiwan and warned Western countries against interference, leading to another great power clash with ramifications for space. Seeking to deter other countries in its areas of interest, China also focuses on space assets of adversaries. China's concept of deterrence reflects a growing concern with Chinese interest in space, and both China and Russia view the space domain as integral to deterrence strategy. But for deterrence strategy to work, the parties involved need a common understanding of deterrence and what actions trigger escalation. Could the potential for successful deterrence in space be facilitated by an agreement among adversarial powers on an escalation ladder in the space realm? An exploration of Russia, China, and the United States views of the use of space and counter space weapons, escalation, and deterrence in space, and how those views differ could yield insight. And is this likely in the current global international structure? So if we look at the literature that exists on the challenges to deterrence in the space domain, it can really be summarized by two main observations, and there is a vast amount of literature. The first is that deterrence in space is really a multi-domain prospect, and second is the absence of agreed upon norms and meanings for a shared framework among adversarial powers. A 2021 RAND study found that space deterrence requires credibility and cross-domain response, the establishment of behavioral norms, the imposition of significant costs for aggression, and the need for strategic coordination between the United States and allied countries. While a broad multi-domain space deterrence is necessary, without a common understanding of a shared framework, this type of effective deterrence is circumspect. Steve Lambakis offers a guide for thinking about space deterrence, specifically focusing on China, but I think many of his conclusions are universal. He argues that US planners must prepare for military confrontation with China that involves the space domain, and that a broad deterrence must be put in place. The aggressor must perceive that unacceptable costs will follow an attack on US assets such that the goals of the aggressor cannot be achieved. And according to Lambakis, this type of deterrence requires a known retaliatory capability in space and on Earth, and that the US be cognizant that an attack has occurred and know the origins of the attack. Lambakis makes a critical point that the US will never simply fight just a space war, but will fight a war that escalates into the space domain, and that space deterrence depends upon the sum of all US military capabilities. I think his point is critical because the US faces such a potential scenario now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also the Chinese claim on Taiwan and its activity in the South China Sea. So if we look at Russia, Russia seeks a return of the Russian Empire with the former Soviet borders. It challenges the existing US-led international structure and seeks to reestablish its global position and to change the rules and norms of the current international structure. Russia views space as a war-fighting domain, and that in order to win future wars, it will need to achieve space supremacy. Russia also emphasizes counter-space systems to neutralize US military and commercial space-based services. Russian military space operations fall under the Russian Aerospace Force, and civil programs falling under Roscosmos. Russian space industry is owned nearly entirely by the state, and the executive body managing the space industry, Roscosmos, carries out research, design, and production of space assets for both military and civil purposes. Purposes are dual use, which means more nefarious objectives can be masked under a peaceful guise. The 2021 annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community identifies Russia as a main space competitor, and it is integrating communications, positioning, navigation, timing, geolocation, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance into its command and control and weapons systems. Russia focuses on anti-satellite weapons to degrade US and allied capabilities, and in space and counter-space weapons to target US and allied satellites. The Defense Space Strategy Summary of 2020 identifies Russia and China as the greatest strategic threats due to counter-space capability and military doctrine for space conflict. Furthermore, it defines the space domain as a central arena of great power competition with China and Russia. The US-Russian relationship is on the decline as the Russian and Chinese relationship is becoming more strongly aligned. For example, Russia and China are cooperating to establish a research base on the moon, the International Lunar Research Station. Russian testing of satellite vehicles facilitates the goals of shared cooperation and space development and exploration with China. And simultaneously, these advances can be used for military purposes against US and allied interests. In contrast, Russia has announced its intent to leave the International Space Station after 2024, but it's unclear on the exact timing of departure. And given the Chinese-Russian alliance, it is notable that from 2019 to 2021, the Russians and Chinese combined operational space fleets grew by about 70%. And from 2015 to 2018, their combined satellite fleets increased greater than 200%. And those figures are from a 2022 Defense Intelligence Agency report. And if we look at China, China sees itself as a re-emerging great power hegemon. The Strategic Support Force contains the Space Systems Department and the Network Systems Department, which share counter-space capabilities. The design of the SSF is influenced by the Maoist ideal of peacetime-wartime integration. According to the Space Threat Assessment of 2021, put out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Maoist principle of integration is, quote, well suited for the dual use nature of many space and counter space activities. Military civil fusion is emphasized, in which dual use technologies are geared toward the benefits of the military. China can threaten US satellites with its direct ascent ASAT capabilities. And China is also developing ground-based laser stations, including a location that conducts ASAT tests. China also maintains electronic and cyberspace capabilities, and it sees counter-space weapons as essential. China views the exploitation of space as key to deterrence in other domains, and space weapons use as, quote, the highest rung on the escalation ladder of deterrence. Chinese military doctrine provides for attack in space to protect core interests, and using counter space operations as a prelude to conflict is viewed as defensive. China's use of space must be understood within its overall world framework. As pointed out by Christopher Stone, US space deterrence framework relies upon the Western-based international system and codes of conduct, whereas the Chinese concept of space deterrence emphasizes warfighting capabilities. The Space Threat Assessment of 2021 reports that China seems to be shifting its focus from developing counter-space weapons to integrating counter-space capabilities into its operational plans, with implications for dual-use capabilities. And China's perception of United States reliance on space-enabled operations shapes its planning and its campaign. While all countries claim publicly that outer space is common to all and should be used for peaceful purposes, this can mask intent. For example, China's stance does not impinge on its ability to develop, test, and deploy Earth-based counter-space weapons or the development of space-based weapons, nor does it prevent the use of force against space-based objects during conflict. China, like Russia, claims an inherent right of self-defense regardless of treaties and emphasizes a first strike military strategy. It's important to realize that China's rise as a space power is connected to its rise as a global power. With the United States, both China and Russia are displaying characteristics of global revolutionary powers in the sense that they seek to change the existing international structure. In contrast, the United States seeks to conserve the current global structure while developing space norms and frameworks out of that system. It is a defensive strategy overall, while there are elements of offensive capabilities. So how does the US see deterrence and counter space weapons? The Defense Space Strategy, issued June 2020 by the Department of Defense, stated that US Spacecom was a new combatant command, and it would provide a full-time operational focus on the employment of military space power, integration, and also deterrence. The goal is to shape the strategic environment to deter attacks in space and, if necessary, fight and win a war. The strategy notes the importance of working with the State Department to develop a common understanding of behavior in space in order to reduce misperceptions. About a year later, on 2 years later, on April 22nd, 2022, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen H. Hicks emphasized that integrated deterrence is the foundation of US defense, and that Russian and Chinese proliferation of ASAT weapons directly threaten US and allied assets necessary for global stability. Assistant Secretary for the Air Force, Frank Calvelli, and General David D. Thompson called for a transformation in the Space Force and stated that integrated deterrence starts in space. A defensive approach is reflected in the very different way of approaching ASAT weapons, for example, and was expressed on April 18th, 2020, in a speech by Vice President Harris on establishing norms in space. A particular note is that she stated that the US unilaterally, quote, commits not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing. She specifically stated, simply put, the tests are dangerous and we will not conduct them. The Vice President noted the US was the first country to make such a commitment and called on other countries to join the United States. The hope is that Russia and China will join the US and ban anti-satellite testing. Retired General Kevin Chilton, however, stated that while the administration's goal to define norms in order to establish space as a peaceable domain is admirable, US adversaries do not necessarily share the same goal. To maintain deterrence, Chilton states that the US ban must not constrain the United States from development of its own offensive space capabilities, including the ability to hold enemy satellites and systems at risk. Chilton also notes that power instruments work in tandem, and that the only way to deter against hostile intent is to align diplomacy with military power. The targeted countries of the ban are obviously China and Russia, with the hope of leading by example. However, as indicated by Steve Lambakis, for leading by example to work, there must be a shared moral framework and understanding of reasonable behavior. China and Russia are not looking to the US for how to behave. I think he's correct, but I think taking it a step further, not only are Russia and China not looking to the United States for how to behave, they want to actually change the rules of behavior. So if we look at the international structure, one thing that it's important to realize is that how space is approached is not a domain outside of the current international structure. The international structure is one of hegemonic challenge to the existing order. The United States policy is based on maintaining the current structure, developing international rules and norms for the space domain, and conserving the current system. While both China and Russia have announced that they do not view the current system as legitimate, seek change of the international system, have announced a new security alliance, and both look for fundamental changes in world order, with offensive space operations part of that greater design. Space policies, including deterrent strategies, flow from this dynamic international system. And both China and Russia display actions and intent that indicate a willingness to act to change the system. So what does all this mean? If we look at Robert Gilpin, and I like his illustration because I think he explains well systemic change being change in the international system. And he puts forth a theory of hegemonic change or hegemonic warfare that describes what happens when states or entities within the system believe that they can change the system. So basically, an international system is stable or in a state of equilibrium if the more powerful states or entities within that system are satisfied with the existing system, or no powerful state or group believes that a change in the system would yield additional benefits worth the cost of bringing system change. Over time, differential growths of power result in a redistribution of the power in the system. The system moves from equilibrium to disequilibrium due to changes in power arrangements within the system, such that increased benefits of change or differential power growth has actually altered the cost of trying to change the system. So international distribution of power has undergone radical change. There is a weakened system. This leads to a crisis, which may result in hegemonic warfare, which is warfare to change the system, where what emerges is a new redistribution of power and a new system as there is a resolution of systemic crisis. I would add that it is the perceived power of the states, the perception of benefits and costs that are important, especially in a domain where dual-use technology and deception is prevalent. The contest for space is playing out in a system with a redistribution of power with unsatisfied great powers. Their perception of the willingness and perceived power of the US to respond to and deter attacks may be such as to change the cost-benefit calculation for systemic change. This, combined with the ambiguity of the dual-use nature of the space domain, may increase the opportunity for misjudgment and inadvertent conflict. The United States, as a conservator of the system, and Russia and China as challengers to the system, are unlikely to form agreed upon norms and rules, and the ambiguity of the space domain makes the escalation ladder difficult. So what is a possible option, a possible course? Perhaps a combination of a unilateral declaratory policy with an escalation ladder is an option the US can pursue, but this requires that the US ensure that Russia and China both take its declarations seriously. As noted by Christopher Stone, when the US declares a deterrent threat, it must be taken seriously. There must be a credible resolve to carry out the action, and this goes beyond an ability to only attribute the attack or absorb the attack. The risk of deterrence failure increases when the threat to respond to it is not taken seriously. There has to be a perceived willingness to retaliate at the risk of escalation in order to maintain a status quo. And in this case, the status quo is the current structure. So once that perception is achieved, at that point, it may be possible that adversaries can then see it is no longer profitable to undergo or to attempt systemic change, but to work within the system to gain the best outcome for security interest and for a shared peaceable use of space. And thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Fischel. And we'll now move to James Roney, who will give his presentation. James, I believe you'll want to share your screen.
Yes. I'm going to do is find it again. Where's it? Come on. Oh boy. Sorry.
No worries.
Ah, here we go. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think you'll find that this presentation I'm about to give you is going to dovetail really well with Dr. Fischel's. Even though we didn't collaborate, it's going to sound like it. So anyway, I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of the inherent instabilities in the system. And one of the things that I'm finding out is has to do with Russian and Chinese inspection and repair satellites. This has been going on for a while, and it's a deterrence and crisis management Trojan horse. So over the past 5 years, both Russia and China have intensified their effort to put these, what they call small inspection and repair satellites, or INRS satellites, into orbit with the capability of performing rendezvous and proximity operations. These RPOs are nothing more than a satellite flying essentially information with another satellite. U.S. intelligence agencies have classified these satellites as dual purpose and as a potential counter space threat to elements of the U.S. space architecture. This study was a part of a research effort in support of a follow-on journal article. And I start out basically with the research question that says, how will the United States maintain space deterrence and strategic crisis stability in the wake of adversaries launching, operating, and maintaining inspection repair satellites? From a theoretical framework perspective, consider this in light of the great power theory that states that rising powers will often challenge status quo powers for the express purpose of altering international power structures and norms of behavior. China is considered right now as a rising economic and military power. Russia can be viewed as a borderline great power that uses its military influence, especially its 6,500 nuclear weapons, to affect change in the global order. And the United States is seen as a status quo power looking to maintain the current liberal world order in light of new and evolving economic, geopolitical, and military threats. From a research design perspective, I'm basically using a comparative analytical design. The study considered behaviors, actions, investments, and organizational changes of the three main adversaries from a strategic cultural perspective. Though neorealism and constructivism addresses some of the anarchical and structural issues involved, some of the shortcomings that we found out during the Cold War demonstrated that culture, history, and leadership actually plays a significant role in determining some of the more favorable strategic preferences underwriting some foreign policy, including the need for space deterrence to deal with some of these issues at hand. Let's see, here we go. So space is very quickly moving from a position of militarization to weaponization. Space has actually been militarized since the launch of Sputnik in 1957. The United States quickly followed with small satellites and ISR type satellites, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance satellites. The Eisenhower and Khrushchev administrations quickly realized the value of overhead space assets for monitoring the nuclear proliferation activities by both countries. So there really was kind of a tacit agreement not to interfere with either country's space assets or their infrastructure. In addition, it was clearly recognized that the technology required to knock out satellites just simply didn't exist back then. And the idea of trying it was really more trouble than it was worth. However, both countries recognized the ultimate value at some point in time of being able to destroy the other side's space assets. David Todd noted that to date, Russia, China, India, and the United States have actually designed, developed, and experimented with kinetic kill anti-satellite weapons. None have actually been deployed operationally yet. The kinetic kill ASATs demonstrated the efficacy of the concept. It also created more problems than it solved, in that several of the demonstrations, especially the Chinese demonstration in 2007, actually created a rather large debris field in orbit that'll be there for decades and actually presents itself as a hazard to space navigation. Alex Hollings commented that anti-satellite theory and technology has evolved since those early tests of the 60s. And nowadays, directed energy and direct contact systems are now being explored and tested. Space was essentially an operational sanctuary for almost 65 years, but that's changing now. Space was militarized in 1957, and it may soon be weaponized. So space is being considered a new operational medium. It's joined the air, land, and
it looks like we're having some technical difficulties at James's end. Well, hopefully James can rejoin, or hopefully his internet connection will be stabilized. In the meantime, we can go and tackle some of these questions. Here's a question from John Schmidt, and I believe that's related to what Professor Fischel was talking about. It says, deterrence in space or space in deterrence? I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
I deterrence. Deterrence in space or space in deterrence. I'm going to say deterrence in space.
I suppose maybe that has to do with focusing a deterrence strategy specifically in space, or whether a deterrence strategy should involve all of the activities of the United States that include space. But if that's not the case, maybe John can clarify.
I think this is it is a multi-domain strategy. It's an approach to deterrence. You know, we have a space domain, air, land, sea, space. It's all integrated now. And it's really an integrated approach to deterrence. And what I was trying to kind of bring in with the ending of the presentation is it's also, it goes not just the air, land, sea, space focus for deterrence, but on a perception of the international system itself and the structure of the system, and thinking about whether or not one should try and change that structure. So it's coming at it from a structural approach as well as the typical across domain approach to deterrence. Hi, Jim.
Hi, I cannot believe my computer decided just then to reboot itself.
Oh no!
No worries.
That would be my.
We were tackling some of the questions while you were away, but you can resume your presentation.
Sure, I'm going to try to sharing again. Oh, come on, let's go. Oh, it may not be. Oh, I know why. Okay. Tell you what, if you guys want to continue the discussion, I'll go ahead and get this ready.
Okay. Here's a comment from Arnold. Please discuss space security as opposed to space please discuss space security as opposed to space defense. I suppose the question is, what's the difference, or if there's a difference?
I don't think you're going to have space security without a strong space defense. Um, you're going to have to define your security in a certain way. Let's assume that it's a peaceful use of space, a peaceful, cooperative, exploratory use. Okay, let's say we can be secure and engage space collectively. You're not going to be able to do that without having an adequate defense, because there are actors out there who do not necessarily share that same concept of space. So I think the two actually go together. And
Okay.
hi, Jim.
Okay,
He's back. So I'm
am
going to
ready.
go. I'm going to mute. I'm going to mute now.
Okay. All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for the interruption. All right, so as I was saying, space is a new operational medium. It's joined the air, land, and sea. The U.S. experience in 2 Gulf Wars have clearly demonstrated that space assets are force multiplying linchpins in the successful prosecution of modern wars. And the U.S. dependence on space was not lost on adversaries who quickly perceived that space could well be the Achilles heel of U.S. warfighting doctrine, organization, investment, and capability. Both Russia and China have integrated space into their military doctrine and reorganized their force structures accordingly. Part of that restructuring was the recognition that counter space was a critical component of successful terrestrial operations and that enemy space assets simply had to be put at risk. Since the turn of the century, Russia, China, the US, and India, and to a lesser extent, Israel, North Korea, and Iran, have emphasized the need to deny, degrade, disrupt, and if necessary, destroy an adversary's space assets. Dual-purpose satellites have now entered the mix of potential anti-satellite weapons available for use by these countries. This new reality implicitly creates a strategic deterrence and crisis management issue. Though different than nuclear deterrence, space is nevertheless tied to verification and validation activities essential to nuclear deterrence. Therefore, space deterrence and crisis management stability are becoming critical strategic issues. Let's see. Satellites come basically in all shapes and sizes. Operational satellites can have a mass of anywhere between 500 and 15,000 pounds, depending on the mission, the altitude, and the orbital location. Satellites generally reside in 3 primary locations, which is low Earth orbit, that's up to about 1,200 miles, medium Earth orbit operating up to from 1,200 to 22,000 miles, and then geostationary orbits, which are basically 22,236 miles. Satellites are large and they're very expensive investments. Whether we're talking about commercial communications or remote sensing systems or the military's intelligence surveillance, some of these systems can cost upwards to a couple $2 billion apiece. Figuring the cost of research and development, testing, launch systems, space-borne infrastructure, including ground control systems, telemetry monitoring, and the overall architecture, and the investment can easily top over $1 trillion. Currently, most U.S. space launches occur on and off pads and ranges on both the east and the west coasts. Tracking, communication, telemetry processing are accomplished at various sites across the nation. If you look at both Russia and China, they have similar kinds of support architectures and sites. So let's take a look at specifically at these inspection and repair satellites. Though the 1967 Outer Space Treaty bans nuclear weapons in space, there really is no such ban on conventional weapons moving either to, through, or from space. To date, only loosely agreed upon activities and international norms of behavior have actually acted to prevent wholesale weaponization of space. So we look at Russian and Chinese inspection and repair satellites. These may be altering the dynamic. These systems are usually small. They're ejected from a larger satellite system for the express purpose of performing a rendezvous and proximity operation on a third satellite. They can get pretty close. In fact, they can get right up and touch them. Several experiments using these systems performing IPOs have been carried out over the last 5 years. Both Russia and China have stated that these are benign systems and designed to merely carry out servicing or minor repair operations on some of their own distressed satellites that have either degraded or ceased operations. The U.S. strategic intelligence community, however, recognizes that these systems have the potential for dual use, both commercial and military. Some of these systems have remote manipulator arms that allow them to actually make contact with and latch onto other satellites. Recent intelligence observations of these INRS satellites, their maneuvering activities would seem to validate the suspicion that these systems, in fact, do serve 2 purposes, one benign and one potentially dangerous and disruptive. I'm going to very briefly go over some of the activities. In August of 2022, a Russian ISNR satellite was trailing a U.S. spy satellite, USA 326, coming within several miles of the satellite. Lorraine Gresh noted that in July of 2020, another Russian satellite deployed from Cosmos 2542 and stalked the USA 245, which was another spy satellite. And in June of 2017, Cosmos 2519 released a small INRS system to inspect one of its own satellites. As far as China, Brett Tingley noted that in January of 2022, a Saijin 21 satellite performed an RPO near a defunct navigation satellite. It grappled with the satellite and actually moved it into a higher orbital plane by several hundred miles. So these RPOs actually raise concerns about the potential militarization of satellites designed to inspect, manipulate, or relocate other satellites. Their dual purpose makes them potentially dangerous from an anti-satellite weapon that can be deployed as an inspection or repair satellite, performing mundane and routine operations only to be activated at some later date with new programming should Russia or China decide to attack U.S. space architecture, possibly as a prelude to some terrestrial military operation. As James Finch pointed out, not unlike in the Cold War, deterrence in space is now becoming a very real geopolitical phenomenon, and as space progresses from being merely militarized to being weaponized, it may soon become the new norm for U.S. space operations. So we talk a minute about deterrence. I think Dr. Fischel covered a lot of this, but also I'll just quickly review it. Conceptually, deterrence is simply the persuasion of one's opponent that the costs and risks of a given course of action outweigh any benefits. The U.S. approach to deterrence in '66, Thomas Snelling defined deterrence as a threat intended to keep an adversary from doing something. Snelling specifically differentiated deterrence from compellence, which he defined as the threat intended to make an adversary do something. Within the United States, deterrence is most often viewed as the power to dissuade as opposed to the power to coerce or compel. Glenn Snyder noted that U.S. strategies and doctrine often differentiate between deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. Deterrence by punishment emphasizes the threat of credible and overwhelming retaliatory action against an adversary who would be sufficient to deter most from conducting any hostile actions. Deterrence by denial refers to the capability to deny the other party any gains from the behavior that is to be deterred. Deterrence by denial, also called dissuasion, can seek two different but related outcomes: discouraging military competition in the first place and conveying the futility of military activities because desired objectives cannot be achieved. If you look at China's approach to deterrence, China's concept is not simply dissuasion, but also coercion. The Chinese are thinking in terms of compellence. The Chinese view of deterrence plays two basic roles. One is to dissuade the opponent from doing something through deterrence. The other is to persuade the opponent what ought to be done through deterrence, and both demand the opponent to submit to the deterrer's volition. Okay, so as we've already raised this research question, how will the United States maintain space deterrence and crisis stability management in the wake of adversaries launching, operating, and maintaining inspection and repair satellites? Well, the U.S. space architecture was built during a time of relative peace, when essentially space assets from all countries were off limits to any satellite attacks. But the landscape is quickly changing, and most U.S. adversaries are keenly aware that terrestrial battle space success in the future will be tied to a very robust and resilient space architecture. Currently, almost all U.S. military and national security agency satellites are essentially undefended and very vulnerable to attack. Adversaries understand that an overdependence on space systems has created a strategic and tactical Achilles heel for the United States. What Washington worries most about is the space Pearl Harbor. So space deterrence is really not something new. It's been around since the advent of nuclear weapons and the birth of some of our earlier satellite programs like the Corona and Samos systems of the early 60s. During this period, the safety of space systems was maintained by their close linkage to our nuclear forces. In peacetime, the space systems provided reassurance that the other party was complying with the nuclear arms control treaties. And during crisis and wartime, our space systems could provide early warning of an attack, enable nuclear command and control authorities to dole out the appropriate level of retaliatory devastation, and conduct battle damage assessment to confirm the weapons detonated as planned. Given these roles, decision makers in Washington presumed that an attack on space assets would prefigure a nuclear confrontation. So the problem of space deterrence in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was independent. If you looked at it, independent of nuclear stability was kind of an uninteresting topic for most decision makers, but that is no longer the case. If you look at space deterrence from the adversary's perspective, from a great power struggle, Russia and China's perspectives on space deterrence, it's an important adjunct to the overall discussion of maintaining deterrence and crisis stability. From a strategic cultural framework, Russia, China, and the US have differing attitudes, perspectives, and strategic preferences when it comes to space deterrence. China's military texts discuss space deterrence as the employment of space capabilities to achieve broad deterrence and political goals for deterrence itself, though deterrence itself is not a goal per se. China does not focus on preventing an opponent from acting specifically within the space domain or against specific space assets. China's political leadership exploits space-related systems to achieve certain political and military gains on Earth. Because China may readily shift military action from one domain to the other, it would prove difficult for China's opponents to deter military action through single domain deterrence efforts. If you turn your attention to Russia now, they view deterrence from kind of a Cold War lens. And so they view adversary space assets as just another target set, separate and distinct from terrestrial ones. The goal of Russian space deterrence is to put adversary space assets at risk so that the probability becomes less likely that adversaries will dither with the Russian space architecture. Russia recognizes that the overdependence of the US on its own space forces to prosecute its modern warfare, and it seeks to hold these US space assets hostage by developing and deploying a variety of space threats, including these advanced space energy weapons and grappling capabilities. So if we look towards a comprehensive US space deterrence strategy, we start with the DIME concept, which is our elements of national power, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. We realize right up front that nuclear weapons are radically different than space weapons. As devastating as space weapons can be, they do not really threaten the extinction of mankind. Counter space systems, on the other hand, are viewed as just another weapon, rather than as weapons that represent the pinnacle of conflict or that define bilateral relationships. Counter space weapons are proliferating in terms of their types, ownership, and employment. Both state and non-state actors are planning on using them to advance their political goals. Rogue states and even terrorists could use counter space weapons to advance their agenda in the future. Inspection and repair satellite systems are no different in that they are potentially destructive, even if they're not necessarily escalatory. And when it comes to deterrence, space systems like terrestrial targets of nuclear weapons share a mutual vulnerability. This space domain is said to be offense dominant, in that holding space targets at risk is far easier and cheaper than defending them. When comparing the cost of a small INRS satellite, which could be $50 to $75 million, to a typical NRO satellite, which could cost $750 to $1 billion, the difference is several orders of magnitudes. Deterrence works best when there's mutual dependencies. For space systems, though, this is actually absent. Although other states increasingly utilize space for economic and military purposes, the United States is by far the most reliant on space systems due to its global responsibilities and high technology approach to warfare that heavily leverages space systems for comm, navigation, and ISNR. This asymmetry creates an imbalance. The more a nation relies on space systems, the more tempted a potential adversary is to target those systems. So we look at some of the key elements of this comprehensive U.S. deterrence strategy. It would include, whoops, sorry about that. So, looking at a course of action here, we need to update our deterrence strategies and doctrines. We need to develop a credible and trusted space attribution framework, create a space deterrence network that includes defensive or coping mechanisms which either raise the inherent costs of conducting the attack or minimize the benefit of the attack in the first place, convincing the adversary that the contemplated aggression will not succeed, or if it does, the effect will not outweigh the cost of carrying out that action and how it contributes to deterrence. We need to enhance our resilience, augmentation, and the ability to operate in a degraded environment. These all contribute to both deterrence in space and to the space component of strategic stability. We need to augment our national space system through partnerships that also provides an additional margin that makes it harder for potential adversary to deprive forces of the space-derived capabilities that enable modern warfare. We need to prepare U.S. and coalition forces to conduct successful air, land, sea, and cyber operations in a degraded space environment. The concepts of operations, tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as redundant cross-domain capabilities, must be developed and exercised so that our forces can succeed in their missions regardless of an adversary's counter-space campaign. Encouraging restraint. Convincing a potential adversary that not taking a particular action is in a specific circumstances is a preferable alternative. And we need to develop diplomatic back channels, military exchange opportunities, and technology showcasing to reinforce the downsides of negative behaviors. All right. So in conclusion, the three elements of deterrence framework, imposing cost, denying benefits, and encouraging restraint, do not have to be present in equal measure. By its nature, deterrence is adversarial and context specific. Within the broad framework presented here, the United States must tailor specific approaches to specific potential adversaries in different scenarios. Some combinations of these three elements will be required, and the elements must be applied within an overarching framework that is consistent to ensure credibility against multiple actors. While many lament the U.S. dependence on space, those capabilities do provide an unparalleled ability to project power globally across all domains. To ensure the United States maintains the strategic advantage derived from these, it must develop a posture that not only deters counter space operations, but also ensures space instability does not collapse the threshold for deterrence failure during a broader terrestrial crisis. Such an approach offers the best chance to deter conflict and enhance strategic stability while also providing national leaders with the ability to prevail in a conflict should space deterrence ultimately fail. That's all I have, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, James. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
We can continue with the questions. Here's a question from Mike Gray. Could you talk about, and this is for either of you, so whoever wants to answer these questions, could you talk a bit about the any U.S. vulnerabilities in the space domain that are likely to be exploited by China and Russia?
Kim, do you mind if I take that?
Sure, go right ahead.
I'm sure you can follow up. What I personally worry about is the fact that we have an architecture that's composed of very large and very expensive satellites. Probably because space was a sanctuary for such a long time, we didn't really prepare defenses for those. It's left us very vulnerable. Some of the things we're looking at are maybe, kind of the SpaceX Starlink concept, where they have kind of proliferated architectures of smaller, highly capable satellites. We could develop technologies to actually post some of our own inspection and repair satellites up there around our larger assets to act as a defense mechanism. But that's years in the future. Right now, we're very vulnerable, and the only way we're going to get out of this is to provide some kind of a defensive capability for the larger systems, and eventually change the nature of the architecture to become more dispersed with hundreds and if not thousands of specific satellites doing a specific job. That way, if they degrade part of the architecture with rapid launch capabilities, we can repair that damage, and the architecture itself will remain intact and useful.
Thank you. Kim, did you want to add to that?
I really don't have anything to add. As I stated earlier, and Russia and China both have made absolutely no. They have not been reticent in acknowledging that the United States is so dependent on space-based information. It's dependent upon it for command and control, for forces in the field that to attack, to disrupt that dependence on space is really a key to eventually defeating the United States.
Yeah, both Russia and China were excellent students coming out of the Gulf Wars.
Yes, they were.
They took a lot of notes. They completely restructured themselves internally. They actually had Space Force before we did. Their doctrine, their strategies, everything was predicated on how the United States fought those wars. And so just like they steal other kinds of technologies, fighter technologies and submarines and aircraft carriers, they also basically mimic the doctrine and organizational strategies that we did to acquire that kind of capability. So don't be surprised if what we're looking at in the next war is a mirror image of ourselves.
Here's a question from Professor Bert Chapman. He's been a speaker actually at previous years at this conference. His question is, what language should we specifically include in our space deterrence doctrine to dissuade space adversaries like China and Russia from attacking our space assets? Will result in ruinous retaliation by the US and its allies against their space assets?
That's a really interesting question in terms of language. I don't know the exact answer to that question in terms of what language should we include, but I also don't think it's so much as what language should we include is, do they believe it? So what is conveyed, what is communicated? If you do X, then Y is going to happen. However you communicate that, whatever you use, it must be believable. So
Yeah,
the key is the perception of the Chinese, the Russians, regardless what language you use, do they believe it?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kim. And one of the problems we have with space deterrence is I don't believe that the decision makers have made up their mind in terms of if some of these large systems are attacked, are those systems worth an escalation of activities on the ground? Whereas, if somebody lobs a nuclear weapon, obviously that's automatically escalatory. So the question becomes, what is the threshold
Exactly.
for space deterrence? How many systems do they have to take out before we respond in either a conventional or a nuclear way? So they know that these systems are extremely important to us. Our entire commercial and military infrastructure is predicated on these things like GPS and comm satellites. The other thing people don't like to talk about is we have kind of an agreement between the government and our commercial suppliers of satellites. We have commercial comm satellites that we use in military operations. I don't know if anybody's bothered to tell these commercial entities, but in the event of a war, they become as much of a target as the military satellites. And I don't think they have figured that into their bottom line, but that is the reality of it. I've participated in several war games where commercial satellites were taken out. So these are parts of this whole deterrence strategy and this whole deterrence thought process that we haven't really quite thought through. But I think the threshold on when we go nuclear or escalate a conventional military operation, depending on the loss of space assets, is something we really need to discuss.
Okay, here's a question also from Professor Arnold Nikogosian, who was a speaker yesterday in two of our panels. His question is, under what conditions will military astronauts will be deployed on the moon or Mars? Currently, most astronauts, cosmonauts, etc., have a military background. Are there any legal issues?
I don't know. Do you know that one, Jim?
I have seen some things written about whether there or not there should be. There is nothing currently written about military astronauts. I suspect that if a country tries to plant a flag on the moon and decide that it belongs to them, that the next step may be to put military astronauts on the moon. But as far as military astronauts just simply doing their astronaut duties, there's very little written about it, and no one really wants to talk about it. The laws of the sea also apply to space, so that if a military astronaut in the concept of doing his job, his normal peacetime NASA astronaut job, for some reason comes down over somebody's country, they have the obligation to rescue him and provide medical assistance and to release him back to the home country. So he can't be declared a military combatant. That's about all I know about that subject.
Do you know if there is anything currently in place prohibiting the US or any sovereign nation from launching and operating stealth vehicles and tech in space, I assume?
No, there's the 67 Outer Space Treaty. The only thing it talks about is nuclear weapons in space. It deliberately stayed away from conventional weapons. It also stayed away from conventional systems. So all the nations are free to put anything they want up there, essentially, as long as it doesn't threaten someone else. But there's actually no laws against it. So if China or Russia wanted to put some of these IR and F satellites around some of our bigger NRO satellites and just park them out there, there's not a thing we can do about it. And whether they are a threat or not, that becomes part of this deterrence question.
Yeah, I agree. And basically the reason for that is if those things were included, you most likely would not have gotten the treaty.
That's absolutely right. In fact, the United States has deliberately not signed some of those things because it doesn't want to impair its own ability to respond in kind if the Russians and Chinese decide to break those treaties.
Quick question from Jonathan Albin is he's wondering if there's a way for him to get a copy of your slideshows so he can brief them to his unit. Would you be willing to share your slideshows?
Yeah, absolutely. He can reach out to me at Jim Rooney, JIMROONEY, Jim Rooney 6 at gmail.com, and I'll be happy to supply him with whatever he wants.
Yes, Kim. Hang on. I will type it into the chat, I believe. Is that?
Yes, or Jonathan, if you want, you can just simply message the organizers, respond to any of the emails you've been receiving from Huba, and we'll facilitate that information. I think that would be the easiest. There's a question from Ruben Patino. Your first question, Ruben, is very long. I must ask you to please simplify it. Your second question, who are we trying to deter and in what context are your state-based governments most concerned? I think a big part of this presentation was specifically about China and Russia, but I don't know if Kim or James would have anything else to add to that question.
The only thing I would add to that question is that Russia and China are the two primary adversaries, but they do sell technology across, to Iran and to North Korea. And as we've seen oftentimes, large states, great powers tend to use smaller states as proxies in wars. And it could very easily happen that Iran or North Korea gets some of these anti-satellite weapons, and they could do the bidding of the Chinese or the Russians, and we could find ourselves in a different kind of a war. So there's nothing stopping that from happening other than the fact that deterrence probably isn't going to work in that situation.
Kim, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
I would say look at North Korea, look at Iran. There are other actors out there, but China and Russia are the main challenges right now. And there are also linkages between China and Russia and Iran and North Korea.
How about non-state actors?
Well, again, that's always a possibility. There's no way to tell whether these either failed states or terrorists operating outside of a state are making contact with the Russians, the Chinese, North Koreans. There's no way to tell. I would imagine our strategic intelligence community has some information on that, but I would be concerned about a terrorist getting a hold of an anti-satellite weapon and just blowing up a U.S. ISR satellite, because that gets back to my presentation, which basically says we need a way to find out who does these things, and attrit it back to the person or the state or the terrorist who actually did it. The most dangerous thing we can do is blame the wrong person or blame the wrong state. And so just to sow confusion and uncertainty into the system, I wouldn't be surprised to see a terrorist try to get a hold of some of these.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the ambiguity of space.
Absolutely.
It makes it extremely dangerous.
Well, I don't think that there are any more questions. So thank you, professors, for these presentations, and thank you to our attendees. We are reaching the end of the conference. The next session is simply a set of final announcements, so we hope to see you there. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.